All right. So, once again, a very warm welcome to all of you to our second Adda for this season. And we are extremely delighted to have Melissa Steyn with us. So, Professor Melissa Steyn have been working in different spaces in academia. And she has worked in the University of Cape Town. She has worked in the University of Witwatersrand. And also, it's very essential to highlight the fact that she was one of the founders of the Wits Center for Diversity Studies at the University of Witwatersrand. And it is, as she has published amazingly around different journals, books. At the same time, she has worked in several spaces that transition between academia and activism. And currently, she is the Professor Emeritus at the Wits Center for Diversity in the University of Witwatersrand. She has worked in very interesting spaces, which some of which includes critical diversity literacy, a perspective that we are going to reflect on today, which actually serves as the foundational ground for the center, Wits Center for Diversity Studies, to be precise. And also, there is another very interesting perspective that Melissa has deeply engaged in is the critical whiteness studies, which I think critical whiteness studies and critical diversity literacy, they very much speak to each other. And I'm sure we will get into that conversation as we go ahead in due course of time. Once again, Melissa, a very warm welcome and thank you for your time to join our Adda today.
It's my very great pleasure.
And yes, also I must mention, which is my bad that I forgot to mention, that when I was a postdoctoral student at the Wits Center for Diversity Studies, I had this great privilege of having Melissa as my supervisor. So I also have worked closely with her across projects and in various professional spaces as well. So without further delay, and if I can start off with a very foundational question, because we have a very diverse audience who may not be very familiar with the idea of critical diversity literacy. So, to start off, Melissa, I mean, we are all aware of the fact that this whole aspect of DEI, right, diversity, equity, inclusivity, has been in place for a long period of time by now. I mean, whether we go for professional, spaces, you're going to official spaces where we see almost every institution have a DEI policy in
Mm,
place. Of course,
mm,
at least on pen and paper.
mm.
So, and of course, when you were, started, and if I correctly remember, that critical diversity literacy started as a project when you were based at the University of Cape Town. And then
That's right.
gradually it multiplied and expanded into a full-fledged institution and research projects, activist work, academic work, etc. Even during that point in time, DEI was very much in place. So,
Mm.
what made you, if we start off with a very basic question, what made you feel that DEI is not sufficient? We need a critical diversity literacy as well.
Thanks for that question, Cheyenne. It's really important. Um, DEI follows in the footsteps of a very or the liberal understanding of diversity, which goes back to like John Stuart Mill's, you know, the idea that it's about individuals, and that when you have different people with different backgrounds um, studying together, which is where it really was initially understood as sort of within university contexts, the educational environment is richer, and you learn better, you learn more, and your frameworks that you bring to a particular context will be challenged. And in this way, you grow intellectually. So that really was the origins of the diversity principle, um, as it has come to be institutionalized. And then this also then spread, of course, into the business world, into corporates, and became institutionalized through things like the business case, where the idea was that if you have greater diversity within your organization, you're going to be able to serve your customers better, you're going to, well, your stakeholders generally better, and ultimately you're going to be more profitable. Um, but but as I indicate, I mean, this is about firstly the the primary beneficiary, as understood in this particular understanding of diversity, is the centered person. You know, it's the people who are already in the university, it's the people who are already in the organization, or the organization's interests, who center the interests, who will benefit from diversity. And it's about bringing in sort of representative numbers of others, in order to enrich the environment. Um, it's not it's not actually about social justice. The critical diversity perspective comes in because I certainly believe that we have to develop a world in which we are comfortable with difference, not just because there are benefits to it, but because this is fundamentally about um, the most basic human justice, which is that we should not be oppressing people on the basis of differences. Difference should not be used as a pretext for oppression, which is how it has been used throughout the colonial modern era. So this is about a liberatory idea of difference. How do we bring people into all contexts, which can be national contexts, um, which can be global contexts, you know, it can be communities, but how do we bring people together such that we can be different together? Different without denigrating the other, without excluding the other, without making the other um, understood to be less than, without making the other unsafe, you know? So it's about how do we create contexts and ultimately a world where we are all valued and respected and have our dignity intact, and have the chance to make our contributions, to be recognized, with our differences in play. So that's the critical perspective. It comes from a very, 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 very different framework and a whole different sort of field of thinking from the traditional DEI.
Thank you, Melissa, for this very comprehensive and for this diverse perspective about the critical diversity, and starting off with the very basic differences of how do we distinguish between, if we use the acronym of critical diversity literacy, CDL, and a DEI. And one essential, very important point I felt that you pointed out is the question of diversity hierarchies, which we hardly talk about, because the moment we use the word diversity, by default, a very horizontal image, comes into our mind. But in reality, when we look into the praxis, and as you rightly mentioned, that there are hierarchies within diversity as well. And of course, I mean, and since, as all of you have observed, that one of the subtitles of this today's conversation is how much it is important in today's times, especially in times of genocides, ecocides, warfare, destruction, extreme levels of hatred, and just
Mm.
normalizing them, celebrating them as if that is how the world should be, of killing
Mm.
each other, of destroying each
Yes,
other.
that's right.
And at that point in time, CDL is so important. Of course, we will get into that conversation for sure in a bit. But prior to that, um, CDL, and as one of your very phenomenal works, and I would like to invite all of you to also go through that work. And I'll share the link in a bit as well, where Melissa, I think one of the primary articles by Melissa on what exactly CDL means. What is CDL? It's there. I'll share the book chapter with all of you. And where, Melissa, you outline about a very important aspect amongst many perspectives of how to practice CDL is to sort of identify and shift the grammar of hierarchies. And it's
Mm.
very important because it is so much embedded, normatively
Mm.
embedded in our everyday conversations, in our everyday
Mm.
actions, which we are conscious about it often. And but
Mm.
we still love to live with them in a very ignorant way sometimes, like, oh, well,
Yes.
this was a joke. Oh, well, I just said that way. Why you are
Mm.
taking it at heart? We are just joking with you, etc. It can be in terms of body shaming, it can be in terms
Mm.
of gender diversity, it can be in terms of various racial connotations, various other perspectives.
Mm.
So I was wondering that would you like to share in terms of the activities that you have done in terms of CDL at the practical level, some of the possible ways of identifying those grammars of hierarchies and violence that are so deeply and normatively entrenched in our everyday conversations, in our everyday actions, and how some of the ways in which you have contributed, the your project has contributed collectively in identifying and trying to make those shifts.
Um, Shan, if I understand your question correctly, um, I would give as an example the work that I have done on critical whiteness studies, which has been, a major component of my own work. Which fits into the critical diversity studies framework because it's important to understand, how power flows and to understand how everybody is positioned within these power flows. I mean, none of us are outside of them. Um, and the recognition of when and how you may be positioned within the dominant positionalities within these power flows is really very, very important and often very difficult for people to recognize and acknowledge. Um, and so you find people in dominant positionalities are much more inclined to want to exercise, as you've said, these politics of ignorance, like um, what's the problem? There's no problem here. And people in the privileged positions within the flows of diversity um, tend to have what Mills called an inverted epistemology, you know, where they don't know, as opposed to where they know, um, where they construct and maintain relationships of ignorance. So what you find is that the people who are in the disadvantaged and the oppressed positions are much, much more likely to understand how power is operating within a particular context or on a particular issue than the people who are in the privileged positions. You know, so I think that's a good example. The work that I've been doing on critical whiteness studies is about looking, particularly here in South Africa, at the ways in which white South Africans construct their sense of self. Now that the country has become democratic, and as we know, across the colonial world, when countries have achieved democracy, when colonialism has ended, white people tend not to stay. They tend to go back to the colonial centers where they are in charge of the most important power dynamic that affects their lives, which is the state. So they go back to where white people control the state and tend not to stay in the contexts where the colonial other has now become the the enactors of state power. What makes South Africa different is that a sizable um, number of white South Africans have stayed and will stay, and now experience themselves living in a context where they do not control the state. And so it's a very interesting sort of context in which to understand how whiteness operates, to both adjust to the new circumstances and at least in form um, agree with and cooperate with democratic practices and democratic ways of being in the world, but at the same time trying to preserve white privilege. So it's an interesting position for whiteness, but the critical diversity literacy comes in that one would have to understand how you are positioned as a white person, and how that positioning influences the way you think and feel and interpret the environment around you, and how that would affect other people. How you might be impacting Black South Africans. I don't know. Does that answer your question, Sean?
Yes, yes, of course, of course. I mean, this is a very good example. This is a very good example, and also thanks for also kind of carrying forward the conversation towards the question of the critical whiteness studies,
Yes.
the question of critical whiteness as well, in a ways,
Yes.
if not specifically studies. And I was thinking of, asking you this question because, of course, the the first time when I got introduced to the idea of critical diversity literacy, um, simultaneously another very interesting idea that came to my mind, and it's also another very fascinating perspective by Sarah Ahmed, the
Mm.
feminist killjoy. And
Yes.
um, of course, if I place these two works side by side, of course, feminist killjoy has a very specific set of gendered cultural context that Sarah Ahmed writes from. It emerges from how gendered and sexual violence are systemically preserved, systemically ignored within the university systems, and what are the different power structures and social dynamics that normatively preserve that in the space. Uh, Of course, critical diversity literacy emerges very specifically from the contexts of race and gender and color and different other intersectional perspectives. But both the perspectives of killjoy as well as critical diversity literacy, of course, of course, speaks to various other contexts as well. And
Mm.
I remember, when I keep on engaging with Sarah Ahmed's work as well, and different interviews I've read of Sarah Ahmed, where she points out that it's a way these kind of approaches, these kind of ideas are a way not to are deliberately a way of unsettling from the comfort zones. And so
Right.
is also CDL. Like
Yes.
you were rightly mentioning about some of the very essentially entrenched comfort zones that gets questioned when we look through the lens of CDL.
Mm.
And I was wondering in that sense, um, what was the reception I mean, what was the reception of CDL? What kind of challenges you faced on your side when you started off with the conceptualizing the framework of CDL, started writing about it, applying it, speaking about it, gradually expanding to different other sectors? What was the reaction? I mean, for sure you have freaked out the DEI people because they would be hating you like anything because you're a big thorn on their pathway for sure. And
Right.
what was it what how did it like? And you started in a very university space, which is always considered as an
Yes,
elite fortified space, right? Which
yes,
would always like
yes.
to usually they would always like to have these things on pen and paper, but when it comes to practical unsettling, they're already always very reserved and conservative about these things. So
Right.
so
Yes,
what
yes.
what was the situation experience in your case?
So, Sean, can I take a step back and just say that
For
in,
sure.
in the actual origin of CDL, it was because I'd started critical diversity studies at UCT, and part of what it was that I was asking myself, what would a graduate, how would a graduate be different from you know somebody who hadn't done critical diversity studies? What would mark a person who had actually um, immersed themselves into this work? What would distinguish them? So that's part of what it was. But the deep origin of CDL was really in South Africa's democratizing process, where apartheid had been formulated, had been predicated on exactly the principles that you talked about earlier of hierarchies, deeply entrenched within a very racist, very patriarchal, very homophobic, ableist, in every way that you can think of, centering the white Afrikaner male. All right, and everybody else was viewed through a very authoritarian lens and should know your place. So when the end of apartheid came, for me, what was needed was we had to rethink society from the basis of assumptions that were the exact opposite, which I've touched on. What would a society be that was open and enabling and supportive of difference and human dignity across differences? So that's really where it came from. So in explaining that, I think I've already suggested what you can imagine some of the challenges were, because obviously the people who are on the privileged side of any one of these axes of difference feel that you're undermining their power base, and that you are dangerous. So, I did encounter a lot of pushback from particularly white men, but also the sort of like to gender and sexuality, and the one that you don't didn't that I didn't really get pushback on was disability, um, which actually taught me that that was a good way to introduce critical diversity literacy in terms of pedagogy, is to start with disability, because once people um, saw that you were talking not about biology, not about impairments per se, but about power differentials and the power of ability, um, to define and confine a disabled person living with disability into this category of disability, and the consequences for the lived life of a person. But once people have conceded that dynamic, then it becomes more difficult for them to just simply say you're talking nonsense. If you if you raise race, for example, and you talk about how whiteness is about a system of power that systematically disadvantages and disenfranchises and disables black people, you know. So that has been an interesting thing in terms of how to work through the backlash that one gets. But Cheyenne, definitely a lot of backlash and a lot of vicious backlash from particularly white men. I mean, I've certainly had my fair share of death threats and such like, and yeah, people are very threatened when they feel that you're undermining the the power base that they feel entitled to. They don't feel like it's privilege. They feel it's entitlement, um, and that they own their positions of superiority and advantage because of their merit, um, and or because that's the natural order and the way it should be, and you should not be messing with that.
True, and while I was listening to you, I was just wondering about the natural order of violence and destruction, um,
Yes,
which is of course have been in place in this planet. But in the recent times, the level to which it is multiplying across the
yes,
world in terms of
yes.
warfare, in terms of genocides, and
Mm,
how, of course, I mean, we do have on the one side, we do have a big community of people who are consistently resisting about this
mm,
normalization of dehumanity. But on the other
mm,
side, we also have a big group of people who finds logic, who finds reason on an everyday basis through policies, through destruction, through genocides, through ecocides, that why these sort of violent orders should be in place. We have the logic of the militarization, we have the logic of industrialization, we have the logic of commercialization, capitalism, dictatorship. And of
mm,
course, I mean, they have always been in place, but this, in the recent times, we see there is always this global surge, a further multiplication of this logic. And it is at that point in time where consistently I have been feeling, and this is precisely, why I very much deeply wanted to have this conversation on critical diversity literacy, like where some of these nations, who are in the at the forefront of supporting wars and genocides and ecocides today, are also some of the nations who were the self-certified champions and pioneers of diversity, equity, and inclusivity. Okay, we can take names of countries like India, we can take names of United States and other countries who within their corporate work structure or in their political policies or in their operational perspectives, whether in the workplaces or in the political institutions, whatever it is, they have always presented themselves that, oh, the whole idea of the large democracies itself so deeply
mm,
tied to this very problematic idea of the DEIO. We are diverse, we are a community of different religions, different class. When it comes to India, different caste. The caste plays a very important role here, etc. Now, but these are also the people who are, these are also the countries, the political institutions from these countries are leading some of the gross violence and warfare
mm,
across the world. And this is where we need to be critical about the whole idea of diversity, the first point. And that is where we think that the critical diversity literacy
mm,
has a very essential role, has a very essential perspective
mm.
to play. But and in this regards, Melissa, if you can share some perspectives, some thoughts that how can critical diversity literacy at a very humble space, I'm not talking about even the bigger things about policymaking, etc., at within our very respective space, to sensitize each other not
mm,
to involve or not to support things that are resulting into mutual destruction. In a
mm.
structured way, in a theoretical way, in a methodological way, how can critical diversity be applied in today's times when we are indulging in these spaces, in these conversations? Every day we are dealing with these dangers of normalizing violence and hatred.
Well, Sean, I mean, you speak to my heart, of course. Um, and I think to just touch on what you said earlier about, the champions of DEI often seem to be the biggest culprits, or are the biggest culprits, don't just seem to be. But I think that's why we do need the critical, because the diversity principle, as it has been formulated in liberal contexts, can become a pretext. It can become a smokescreen for the exact kinds of dynamics that you are talking about. Um, so we've done diversity, we do diversity. Um, because at that level, it doesn't actually in any way influence the power dynamics and the structural issues that actually really do hold, these unfortunate dynamics in place. So one can also think, just like, you have, the old race theory, which theorized, races as normalized natural groups with inherent capacities. And you have critical race theory, which you could see as being critical of that construction of race. In the same way, I would argue critical diversity studies um, um, mobilizes a critical position against that way of understanding diversity. So it is critical of diversity in that particular formulation. Um, but we can't throw diversity away. I mean, it's right at the absolute center of our humanities. The fact that we have normal human variation, and for us to live in ways that are non-violent, non-destructive, non-hierarchical, we have to find other ways, better ways of thinking about each other and of being with each other. Um, so I feel that that's very important. Um, to understand that the conventional DEI is not going to get you there. It's not going to take you there. Um, but in terms of practically how we can use this to influence our environments, um, I do see it, Sharon, I do see it very much as an epistemological tool and as a pedagogical tool. And I think it's very important as a pedagogical tool. Is it that it's important for us to be learning and to be teaching these sort of principles of a healthy diversity stance, a healthy positioning in relation to difference, and of course then to otherness. How do we adopt stances that don't perpetuate othering? Um, so so I don't know if you want me to say more, but I mean I do think that the educational aspect is to me really very very important, because I don't think that these are approaches, attitudes, stances, ways of being in the world that belong to a privileged few. I think this is what we need we need to normalize a critical diversity literacy within the world as we are experiencing it. It needs to be a new norm, um, to correct the hierarchical ways of approaching difference. Um, and I mean, almost. Well, I want to say, Sharon, the problematic dynamics that you name, if you scratch in them, they all eventually will reveal that there is an issue with the way difference is being conceptualized and acted on. I mean, the ecocides, I think, are crucially important for us to understand as diversity issues. You know, we talk a lot about how these hierarchies and the atrocities that we commit against other human beings depend on dehumanization, which means that we're start thinking of and talking about and behaving as if other people are less than human or lesser humans, but more like animals, you know? So the problem then becomes, if we're dehumanizing, the problem becomes that the understanding of the animal, the understanding of what it is to be an animal is the problem. That is the fault. All right, so it's the way in which that otherness is being constructed as being, you know, creatures that don't have, well, sentience is the big one. They don't have feelings, don't have intelligence, don't have opinions, you know, don't have attitudes, don't have rights, don't have dignity that needs to be preserved, and definitely have the right to exist in this world on an equal footing to human beings, every bit as much a right to be here as you and I have, you know. So the construction of what an animal is, and even for that matter what a plant is, but what other life is than the human, is what is problematic. That's what we've got to fix up, you know. So even in these broad scaled horrific destructive dynamics of ecocide, there is fundamentally a diversity issue that is playing out there, the understanding construction of difference in a way that enables it. So I think that diversity literacy is a core, essential capacitation that we need for the world that we're living in, to counter these directions that are self-destructive and destructive beyond us, you know, destructive of our very world.
That's very very important that you shared, Melissa. And in fact, I also want to, you know, get into the question of the ignorance contract as well, which also, and which I understand that you have mentioned previously about the whole ignorance, conscious ignorance, of course,
Mm.
which is a part of the ignorance contract
Mm.
that we often live with in order to not talk about critical diversity. But prior
Mm.
to that, there is a comment from Professor Matre in the chat box, and it reads as, I read Coetzee's disgrace at the university, but I think I'm beginning to understand it in a new light altogether right now. So yeah, I don't know, maybe
Very
Melissa, would you
interesting,
like to
yeah.
comment on that something?
Well, just to say, I'm delighted if the perspective that I'm bringing into this conversation creates a somewhat critical understanding of Coetzee's work too. You know.
Great. And also, I mean, if the rest of you have any questions, anything you want to share, it doesn't necessarily have to be questions from your perspective, from the work you do, because I know some of them working on the question of caste,
Yeah.
Dalit cultures, and different other interrelated perspectives, which are very very tied closely to the ideas of critical diversity literacy. So feel free to put your perspectives there. Sneha has a comment here, if I can share that with you, Melissa. So
Sure.
this is just, I think that we really do talk about inclusiveness and deconstruction of all the dominations, but this can only stand in utopia, which is nowhere. I think ecocides and war, this is not going to end anywhere. So I think Sneha basically talks about the ideas of inclusiveness and deconstruction that we were just critiquing before, that we often talk about inclusivity, we just talk about diversity without really feeding into the contexts, and often trying to imagine a very ideal world where everyone is equal, etc. But then when it comes to the practical state, the application is not there. And she also talks about how, often inclusiveness and these conversations on inclusiveness and diversity without a context often constitutes the war and destruction rather than trying to end them.
Okay. Well, you see, I would say that one of the ways in which a dominant discourse will foreclose the questioning and the deconstruction of its power base is by telling us that it can't be done. It can't be done. It mustn't be done because it's dangerous, and this is the best possible world that we can have, and it's the best for both the dominant and the subordinate people. And trying to change it is never going to work anyway. So I always think we must, hold the arguments that this is just utopian, that nothing can be done. We must hold them quite lightly, because if we accept that, then it means that we just allow everything to roll on forward the way it is, and perhaps get worse. So I think that all the changes that have happened in our societies, that have happened to the embetterment of the worlds of people who have been oppressed or disadvantaged, have happened because some people have not believed that it couldn't be changed, but actually have continued to struggle and fight for that change. Whether we'll ever get to a utopian world, of course, I mean, I don't believe that myself. I think human societies are contested, and I suspect they always will be contested. But I think each generation has to do what they can to leave behind the world in a better shape than they received it, and perhaps to move forward the struggles towards social justice. And the forms of that social justice might take in future generations, that will be for those generations to take on and struggle against in their own right. But I definitely don't think that we should say that we can't make changes. If you understand and believe in the power of social construction, well, by definition, what has been constructed can be constructed differently. It isn't inevitable. It's not a given of nature, like the laws of nature. It's not created by God. It's socially constructed, and that means if it can be constructed one way, it can be constructed another. We can do the world differently. We can do society differently. but that means that we have to believe strongly enough in our agency, and refuse to allow ourselves to be just discouraged. As hard as it can be sometimes, as hard as it can be. I think we can't get tired for tomorrow. We have to keep struggling for what is better. Even though it's a long struggle.
Thanks, Melissa, for the response. I see that Fakra Jamal has her hand up. Yes, Fakra, please go ahead.
Oh, I can't hear.
Can you hear me? Can you
Yes.
hear me now?
Yes.
Um, Thank you so much, Cheyenne, for giving us this opportunity. And Dr. Manisa, nice to hear all about critical diversity. And just to reiterate the same fact that how it's up to us, that hope is never been given. We need to construct that hope. And you are doing this through the critical diversity. And earlier, we have seen the intersectionality, and we are talking about the critical discourse, and everybody just trying to participate in it. I was quite concerned that how do you see the role of the we can say this digital media with respect to just expanding this we can say that these debates of the critical diversity or like that. Do you see that it is quite positive or constructive, productive, or you see that it is more space? I just want to know about your perspective, because I just believe it's a constructive space. That's why I am listening to you, and then I'm learning from you that how we need to see the things in a different perspective. Because I just believe that when somebody was saying something from one perspective, we see the other perspective is quite like implied in it. But once the other person enforces it through another angle, we just shift it to that perspective. For the same reason, we need to have these kind of debates. That's again my comment, and just I want your perspective about that digital space, and especially with respect with reference to youth, because I see a very constructive role of the youth with respect to all these critical diversity debates or like that.
Sorry, that's my phone going off there. I have got it on silent, but it's with the digital world, it's actually linked into my computer, so that's why it still rings. Fakra, thank you very much for that question. I think that what you've alerted me to is that I need to do a lot more careful thinking about the whole question of digital media. My first response is that the media themselves are neither good nor bad. They're just tools that we use for our purposes. And as I said before, society is contested. So whatever gets put out into society, people will grab onto it and do with it what is in their hearts. So I think that obviously digital media offer us wonderful, amazing opportunities and scope for working for the good of our planet. But at the same time, the people who are wanting to promote and perpetuate domination and oppression and violence and these other behavioral sort of formations that we're working against, they'll also use the digital media for their purposes. So unfortunately, I suppose what I end up saying is that we are caught up in a struggle. And this is where, again, I would like to emphasize that I think we need to see the whole issue of diversity within the context of social struggle. What kind of world do we want? What kind of world do we envision? What kind of world do we want? Our own agency and energy to inform, the world. What is that world that we're wanting? And we struggle for that. But we know that other people in our society will be struggling for other projects, other ways of thinking and being, and power to be distributed in other ways. So the big point is, again, I'll say it again. I mean, we have to take it on. If we don't take it on, then we know that even like the digital media will become flooded and dominated by people who do not care for the interests of deep democracy and social justice, and who certainly are comfortable with oppression and marginalization and violation of more vulnerable peoples than themselves. So we have to take it on. We have to see digital media, like everything else, as a site of struggle. That would be my answer.
Great.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Vakra. Thanks, Melissa, for the response. And while I was listening to, and this is a very important question I felt, because while I was listening to the conversation, what was flashing across my mind, and as I rightly mentioned sometime before about the question of ignorance, and it just brought into the question of digital media and ignorance. Especially in a very particular context, I'm mentioning this, especially when we see that there is this outbreaks of the wars and genocides. Of course, what is happening out into the field is the violence, but we hardly talk about the digital violence is triggers in the form of um, celebrating a very dehumanized spectacularity of violence. Like, and what I try to highlight through this is where we often see, like, oh, this particular country has these weapons. They will create AI generated videos. They will gamify, they will get scraps of videos from the battlefield. They will gamify them and present them with all of these heroic musics at the background as if something celebrative is happening in the battlefield, totally ignoring the grossness, the dehumanity, the separations, the destruction, mass destruction that is happening. People generating games out of this, and they often would base this, and I do, because I'm kind of active on the social media front, I see how they do it on the Facebook and Instagram and other social media spaces, as if this is something fun, this is something celebrative.
Yes.
And this is also a way, I always feel the way they are presented, the way people take part into that is also a form of the conscious ignorance of what is happening in terms of mass destruction in the real space. And this is where, again, through this element of conscious ignorance, also comes the question of critical diversity literacy as a way of countering that conscious ignorance. Because where we as people, I mean, we as people on a regular basis who are on the social media, we need to be conscious about the fact of calling them out and not celebrating them.
Right.
Rather than
Yes.
just sitting there and playing that, oh, it's just a game, it's fine.
Yeah, that's
Oh,
right.
we are just creating something art out of it. How can you? We are just creating something, being creative out of mass destruction. And that is another form of, I believe, a habitual normalization of
That's
dehumanized
normalization.
perspectives.
Yes.
And this is so much active on the digital media front. Maybe, I don't know, Melissa, if you have some thoughts to share on these elements.
Well, really, just to agree with you, Sean, that I mean that is a very important space where um, dominant and dominating discourses that enable people to close their eyes to the power dynamics that they are perpetuating, where these are normalized and made to seem innocuous and apolitical, because fundamentally what we're arguing is that all of these spaces are in fact political, you know. So, when is the game a game? It's always there's always critical questions that need to be asked, and dynamics that need to be named, and we have to have the vocabulary to name them, to name the dynamics, to be able to accurately present and counter what is actually happening. So yeah, I would absolutely just say, hallelujah to what you said.
And I think Fakra writes a very important point in the chat box where she mentions that digital critical diversity studies is a very important requirement right now, because how power and narrative plays across digital media, and this is such an essential aspect that we should all think about, especially
Right.
when with the arrival of the AI, the digital
Oh,
violence has taken a
yes.
whole new a set of normalization.
Right, exactly so.
Right.
Yes, exactly so.
Yeah. I mean, every day we see how AI is being used. Again, not being someone who rejects AI, because we
Yeah.
understand these are parts and parcel of our, of our everyday existence. But then specifically, of course, calling out how AI technologies, even in the recent, um, US's invasion of Iran, where AI technologies were used to spot locations of bombarding. And
Right.
then eventually they ended up bombarding a school with
Yes.
160 to 170 children who
Right.
died. And then um, they goes back when they're critiqued, when they're called out, they goes back and they just come with a statement, oh, we are sorry, we detected the wrong location. So this is the level where we as humans have reached, where we can just say an apology and a sorry for a conscious act of destruction, for conscious acts of dehumanization and mass destruction.
Mm.
And I
Mm.
think, Melissa, this is, of course, a never-ending conversation, but as we are running out of time, I have to, conclude the conversation here. But I think with all the great reflections, Melissa, that you have shared, of wonderful points and the questions that all of you have brought in for Melissa for further conversations have deeply added. And to a certain extent, has, at least on our own side, has made us conscious to a certain extent that why critical diversity literacy should not just be understood just another theory, another methodology, but as a way of life. It's a
Yes.
way of life. It's a part and parcel of our everyday existence, our thoughts, our actions, our beliefs, our practices.
Yes.
And yeah, I don't know if Melissa, if you have any last words to share with us.
Well, just to reinforce what you've just said, I mean, literacy is a reading practice. When you are literate, you're able to read the social environment and see through the power dynamics that are operating in a particular context, um, and interpret them, and understand what the implications are. So that is the one aspect of reading, of being literate. But the other aspect is writing. How do we ourselves act into the contexts in which we find ourselves and the issues with which we are engaging with, and that would include the media that we use. So how do we use our literacy when we write into our world? So I think, yes, I'll leave it at that, Shan, to say that let's be aware of both sides of what literacy means, both dimensions.